Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started as I have the top of the hour here. Welcome to the Soil Health Nexus monthly digital cafe series. Uh, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Soil Health Nexus, we are a 12-state extension-led collaboration working to increase soil health knowledge, resources, and research. And the Digital Cafe is part of our outreach and networking. Each month, we feature a different soil health related talk from researchers, extension staff, farmers, crops consultants, you name it, talking about different aspects of soil health. And then after the presentation, we'll have some time for Q&A. And then we do, as time allows, enter some breakout rooms where you can join other folks that have a similar job type to you, whether that's extension and education or researcher or farmer, and talk about our student and talk about the talk, as well as discuss any other things going on in your world as it relates to soil health. All right. I mentioned a little bit about who the Soil Health Nexus is. You can check out our website at soilhealthnexus.org. On there, we have recordings of all of our past digital cafes. We've been doing this for 4 years now. And we also have a suite of resources on the Soil Health Nexus toolbox on a myriad of different soil health topics, from on-farm research to soil health and water quality to soil health's physical, biological, and chemical properties. I mentioned these breakout rooms after the presentation and Q&A. We do have these following topics or categories for folks, and you can self-identify and join one of those that works for you to talk to folks that are in a similar position to you about the findings of the talk today. We will have time for Q&A as well. So please feel free to put your questions for our speaker in the chat box, and we can ask those. This is also a Zoom meeting, so we ask that you all stay muted, but you're also welcome to unmute when the Q&A comes and ask your question orally. So excited to have Alyssa Hall here today. Alyssa Hall is a Ph.D. Doctoral student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and she's going to be talking about some of her research on soil health, grazing's impact on soil health and integrated crops and livestock systems. And I think this is particularly interesting as we actually had a discussion about this as a Soil Health Nexus team not that long ago, and there are not all that many resources available when it comes to integrating crops and livestock systems. It's something that it's just not as much resources available. So really excited to hear about her research as well as focus on that topic. So I'm going to stop sharing and go ahead and turn it over to Alyssa.
In a minute. It's loading. There we go. So hi everybody, like Ann said, my name is Alyssa and I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And most of my PhD work, we're looking at those integrated crop and livestock systems, specifically how grazing impacts different crop parameters as well as soil characteristics. And today we're going to be specifically talking about grazing's effect on soil health in these integrated crop and livestock systems. And so just as a little refresher, soil health is this intersection of the physical, chemical, and biological properties of soil and that soil's capacity to support life above ground and below ground. And so today, when I get into my results, we're mostly going to be looking at this physical and biological component of the soil health. What I'm presenting are very preliminary results on a study that we just did here in 2024. And so we haven't gotten into that chemical side yet so much in that analysis, but this is what soil health is. And those principles of soil health, we want to minimize our soil disturbance, maximize our soil cover, maximize our biodiversity, provide systems that have living roots as much of the year as possible. But also here more recently, there's been a fifth principle that's been added, and that's to integrate livestock. And so that brings us to today, where we're talking about integrating livestock's impact on soil health. Like Anne said too, there's not a lot of research out there from on the academic side in terms of how grazing is impacting soil health. And so we've set out to hopefully try to provide some resources on that. When we started this project back in 2018, most of the arguments against integrated crop and livestock systems were about those perceived negative effects of integrating livestock, specifically looking at compaction, which then could decrease crop yields. And one of those main concerns with that compaction, I guess would be, in the early work that we've done here in the last 6 years, we have seen a little bit of compaction caused by the animals that we put into our different crop rotations, but the takeaway there is that the compaction we see is not enough to impact root growth. And also, it's gone by the end of the growing season. So through those wet dry cycles or freeze thaw, that compaction that we see is mitigated by the end of the growing season. And so we personally are not concerned about compaction in these integrated crop and livestock systems as long as you're managing your grazing appropriately. And so despite these negative concerns that we have about integrating livestock, it is one of those principles of soil health. And so there is perceived positive benefits that come from them. And we're going to try to talk today about those soil health benefits that we're seeing. And so to talk a little bit about the project that I'm going to be presenting the results on today, this study is a smaller field scale study of a very large field scale study, excuse me. And in the larger study, they were able to take a lot of those animal measurements like average daily gain, carrying capacity, all of those things. But the land area was too large to effectively measure the crop and soil parameters that they were wanting to look at. So we scaled it way down. Still are using cattle to graze. It's not simulated grazing, but we're able to more efficiently manage the cropping system so that we can measure those crop and soil parameters here. So we're looking at two different cropping systems, a more traditional 2-crop system, corn and soybean here, and then system 2 is a more diverse 3-crop system with wheat, corn, and soybean. And we're studying it across 6 years, so that 2018 to 2023 that you can see here at the top. And to get into the specifics of the management within each of these systems, in our traditional 2-crop rotation, we planted corn in the spring of the first year, and then after we harvested in the fall, cattle were put out to graze in the winter, that corn residue that was left over. And then the next spring, we planted soybeans. Those were harvested in the fall, and then that ground was left fallow over the winter until that next year where we planted corn again in the spring. In this system, all crops, regardless corn and soybeans, received 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. The way that it was set up, we had to do that across all treatments. And we did manage weeds as they were needed a couple different times throughout the year. So across this 6-year study, our 2-crop rotation went through 3 cycles. And it was grazed on that corn residue 3 times in those 6 years. We did have a non-graze control for this grazing too that we'll talk about later in the results. For that more diverse system, the 3-crop system, it was a wheat, corn, and soybean rotation. And so we planted wheat in the fall, the year before the study started. It grew through that spring and summer, and we harvested in the summer. And then in late summer, we planted an oat cover crop. And then the winter thereafter that wheat harvest, we grazed that oat cover crop and the wheat stubble with our beef steers. And then in the spring, before there was no graze control there, in the spring before we planted corn, we had an additional manure application. So we grazed, we took the cows off, and then we applied manure at a rate of about 20 tons an acre here. And we also included a no manure control for that too. And then year 2, we planted corn. It grew through the summer and we harvested in the fall, and then we grazed that corn residue again in this system. And then the next year we planted soybeans. And at the end of that soybean system, we planted wheat to start the system back over. And again, nitrogen was applied to all of these crops, including those with manure on them at 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre, and we controlled weeds as we needed to. So this is a little bit of an aerial visual of what this plot actually looked like. And with just a reminder in these boxes up here about how we were managing those systems. And these yellow boxes are just indicating the replications that we had. So each treatment was replicated 4 times. And we can see all of the treatments here. We'll focus over here on the left side of the screen. In this first replication, we have our 6 treatments. And so for our 2-crop rotation, we start here with the corn and soybean rotation on the far left. And this dotted line down the middle is where we built our fence to create our non-graze controls. And so in this corn and soybean rotation, after that corn was harvested, we built the fence and we were able to graze this bottom half, and we had our no graze control on the top half. And then another point here is that we had each phase of each rotation present every year. So right next to this corn and soybean rotation, we have a soybean corn rotation happening simultaneously at the same time. And then we have that 3-crop rotation with the manure applied next to those, starting with the wheat here, corn next to it, and then soybean next to that. And then the 6th treatment down here is our 3-crop rotation with no manure, so as that no manure control there. And in the first 6 years of the project, so that 2018 to 2023, we measured plant population and grain yield, as well as general soil nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And across those 6 years, we compared grazing versus non-grazing, as well as comparing those 2-crop rotations to the 3-crop rotations. And in everything that we measured, crop and soil characteristics across those 6 years, grazing and cropping system did not have any significant effect. So at the time that in 2023, at the end of these 6 years, we concluded that integrating livestock does not cause any negative crop or soil responses, which quite frankly was a little surprising to us. We were hoping that with that increased biodiversity, we were going to have positive effects on the agronomic measurements that we were taking, but instead it was neutral. It wasn't good, it wasn't bad, which is still a very important result to find. There are obviously possible positive economic benefits, like that supplemental livestock feed reduction or the ability to rent your crop residues. But for this study specifically, the crop and soils were not affected by the diversity of the rotation or the integration of the livestock into that rotation. And so at the end of 2023, this project was essentially over based on what the plan made by the collaborators and I who designed this project. And so we had to decide what we were going to do. We had this moving into a long-term study if we continued doing it, or we would just take that 6 years of data and be done. And so we did decide to do a residual study here in 2024, which is what we're really going to be focusing on for results today, just to see how that 6 years of management in these 2 different systems impacted soil health specifically. So to do this, we collected soil samples in April, which is the same timing that we had been collecting soil samples for the first 6 years as well. We sampled to 4 inches, and because we're interested in the soil health component of this, we did send these samples to the Cornell Soil Health Lab. And there we evaluated aggregate stability, organic matter, active carbon, phosphorus and potassium, total nitrogen, and soil organic carbon. And then after we sampled there in the spring, we actually planted corn into the entire study, regardless of what was going to be next in the rotation that each of these treatments was in. And we did this since it was the end of the study and we were doing this as a residual because corn has a higher nutrient need. We're hoping that we could see across a uniform plant differences that were happening at the end of 6 years within this system. And the other kicker here is that we did not apply nitrogen to anything in 2024. So we planted this corn, we did not fertilize it, we did control weeds as needed, but the goal was just to see what was happening with that residual soil nutrients that were available at the end of 6 years in these 2 different cropping systems. And so first I'm going to show you what happened with our crop response. So we're going to be looking at the corn yield in 2024. And then we'll talk about the soil health response second. And I know that the whole point of this is to explain grazing's effect on soil health, but it's important to see how the corn yielded and see if the soil health is impacting that as well. So that's why we're going to start there. In the next slide, I will show our yields, but I want to preface that with there were no grazed versus non-grazed effects that were significant for our corn yield. And so the values that we're going to be looking at are averaged across our grazed and non-grazed, just so that that is clear when we move in here. So what we're looking at here is our corn grain yields, which is reported in bushels per acre. You can see over here on the left side of your screen. Across the bottom, we kept it separated out by those different treatments that it had been in the 6 years prior to 2024. So we have those 3 crop rotations here with the manure application. Then the red bar is that 3 crop rotation with no manure. And then the purple and blue down here on the right side are those 2 crop rotations. These letters at the top indicate statistical significance. So if a treatment has the same letter as a different treatment, it means that they are statistically similar. If they do not share a letter, that means that they are significantly different. So when we're looking at this corn grain yield, the first thing that we see is that the 3 crop rotations with that manure applied are higher than anything that did not have any manure application on it. Throughout the results that I'm sharing, we're going to be focusing on these 2 in the middle. So the 3 crop with manure, and then the 3 crop without manure that is in that same phase, starting with wheat, because they're the most easily comparable. And so the key takeaway here is that when including that manure application in the 3 crop rotation, we did have about a 30 bushel yield increase over the 3 crop system that did not have manure. And so we're going to come back to those soil property responses here with hopes that maybe the soil response will explain why we were seeing that increase in yield with the manure. As a reminder, these soil samples were collected in April and at the end of the 6-year study. And again, like the corn grain response, there was no grazing effects. So we've again averaged across that grazed and non-grazed treatment that we had within all of these different systems. So first we're going to look at bulk density, total nitrogen, and soil organic carbon. And like I said, there was no grazing effect, but for these 3 measurements, there was also no cropping system effect. So when we compared that 2 crop to 3 crop, there was no statistical significance there either. So these are just averages for the entire study that we did. So the bulk density, we had an average of 1.3 grams per cubic centimeter. And just as a little bit of a, I guess, connection point here, for a clay loam, that root restricting threshold of bulk density is greater than 1.5. So we did have significantly lower than that. We're not concerned about root restriction in any of these systems. The total nitrogen, we averaged 910 pounds per acre, and that soil organic carbon, we were just under 10,000 pounds per acre. So now these are our aggregate stability values, and they were determined using the sprinkle infiltrometer method. And so a sample is laid out, and there's a simulated rainfall on the soil sample. And at the end of a designated amount of time, the aggregates that are left behind, stable and intact after that simulated rainfall, are weighed and presented as a percent of the total sample that was tested. And so that percent is over here on the left side, and we still have those same treatments across the bottom. And these results are not as clear-cut as the corn yield results were. And so if we focus back on these 2 in the middle, those 3 crop rotations, 1 with manure and 1 without, we see that they share the letter B, which means that they are not statistically different from each other, but there does seem to be a trend that with the application of manure, our aggregate stability goes up with manure compared to that one that does not have manure. And so aggregate stability is important for that compaction parameter, as well as water holding, nutrient holding, all of that. And so a higher number is better. And so with that, we see the trend of an increasing aggregate stability with the addition of manure. And then our next, this would be a more of a physical bordering on biological parameter for that soil health, is our organic matter. Over here, we have our percent organic matter on the left side and those treatments along the bottom. And again, if we go back to comparing those two in the middle that are easy to compare, the addition of manure did have a significant increase on our organic matter over that 3-crop rotation that did not have manure applied by about 0.5%. And then this is our active carbon is a biological measure for our soil health. And this value is found through a process called potassium permanganate oxidation, and it measures that portion of organic matter that is readily available for our soil microbes to eat. So it's really important when understanding that soil food web and providing the food that those microbes need to have an optimally functioning system. And for reference, as we start to look at this, according to Cornell, a value of 600 parts per million is considered a high active carbon value. And so across all of our management, we see that they all have what would be considered a high active carbon value, but we do still want to compare the different measurements, different managements, so that we can do what is best for the system. And so if we come back and we look at these two in the middle again, that addition of manure does have a higher active carbon value than the 3-crop rotation without manure. So like I said, we are still very early in the analysis of this data and the understanding of this data with our looking at all of these different soil health parameters. So there's not a lot there, and we haven't gotten into the nutrients yet, but there was those physical and biological parameters that we had there. And so for a little bit of a summary, we have that first 6 years of data where we did not see any differences in the crop measurements that we took or the soil measurements. But then in year 7, we removed that fertilizer. We didn't apply any fertilizer, no manure, nothing. And we started to see some of these differences that have come up specifically in our grain yield and a few of those soil health characteristics. And so we have a very preliminary hypothesis or a conclusion, you might call it, that there's a potential that the nitrogen we were applying in those first 6 years was just enough that it was masking any of these soil health characteristics, and is definitely grounds for more research in the future for to see how fertilizers are impacting our soil health characteristics as well. And it's also important to note that I didn't say this at the beginning, but in this system, before we started this project, it had a pretty high soil organic matter content across all of the treatments. Before we got started, it was about a 3.5, a little lower than 4% average across all of our plots. And then over the course of the 7 years that we did this, as you saw on that organic matter slide, we have increased that organic matter to an average of 4, or just a little bit over. And so there is a chance that with an organic matter that high, we are buffering some of those drastic changes that we could see. And so more future work that could be done would be on different soil types in different areas so that we could see what the effects are of these integrated systems there. Secondly, as I pointed out before, grazing did not impact any of our soil health characteristics that we measured. So when we compared those grazed and non-grazed, so the title of this presentation was, Does Grazing in these integrated crop and livestock systems impact our soil health? And the answer is that there's no effect. They do not have a positive or negative. Again, it's that neutral effect, which is relevant in the case that there's no positive or negative, which means that you should be able to increase your biodiversity for maybe long-term down the road without hurting your agronomic measurements that you are hoping to achieve in your fields with these integrated systems. And then finally, while grazing had no impact, With that application of manure on that 3-year cycle and the 3-crop rotation, we did see a positive effect on those soil aggregate stability, the soil organic matter, and that active carbon. So some of those physical and biological soil health measurements that we were taking, manure did seem to be the thing that was creating a positive impact on those. So that is what I have. If anybody has any questions, I would love to try to answer them. And I'm looking forward to talking to you guys.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Zoom decided to get angry at this moment. Okay, we do have some questions coming in. This is really interesting. As I said, I haven't seen a ton of research on this, so I think a lot of folks are interested in what you found and have some questions. I'll start it kind of with the questions a little bit more about the methodology, and I think specifically folks are curious about the methodology of that first 6 years that you mentioned of grazed versus not grazed. So Hava is curious about how many animals per acre for the grazing treatment. What's the grazing density?
Yep. So the grazing density for this was about 2 head per acre, was the average that we had each year.
Okay. And then Jean is curious about when you did the manure application, was there a bedding source, i.e. carbon?
Yep. So the manure is a sticking point in this whole project. It was not consistent from year to year in those 6 years that we had. So some years it was pretty fresh. A couple years it was composted, and another year it did come in with a lot of straw and bedding in it. That's a problem with working with animal science researchers and across different departments in the university where you don't have a lot of say in the quality of the stuff that you get. So some years there was a significant bedding source in the manure, but other years there was not. So we're getting into the analysis of that manure and starting to work with how that's affecting things, but we don't have all that data together yet. So.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. And then Mark is curious. I'm just again going over some of the questions that are about methodology first before we have more discussion-oriented questions. Mark is curious about tillage system used.
So this study was it was a no-till system that we were using at the beginning. So 7 years ago, it was in a perennial orchard, and then they tilled that up. They tore all the trees out and tilled that up, and then this was like a no-till conversion. So there's been no tillage used on it since the project has started, but there was tillage used right before we started.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. And then Heather is curious, did you by chance have you talked about like the soil health characteristics and what findings you found, but did you have any like analysis of the microbial communities prior to the start or in conclusion?
Hindsight 2020, we wish that we would have done
Yeah.
that when we started this. When this project started, the professor that I work for is a range and forage guy, and I had no soils background coming into this. And so we were very focused on those plant measurements. And then as things started progressing and soil health has become more and more at the forefront of this type of research, we started pivoting and wish that we had some of that initial soil health stuff, but that was not the original intent of this project. It has ended up being that way. But no, we do not have, prior to the start, any sort of soil health measurements except for going back and maybe being able to do the carbon and that type of stuff.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I understand. We were having different conversations in 2017 when you started in terms. But one question, I'm just going to go again to like what you were measuring again. So
Mhm.
Heather was curious. I think this is about the manure. And you talked about manure was different from year to year. Did you
Yep.
have a manure analysis for each manure source provided?
We do have those numbers. Like I said, we just haven't integrated those into the results that we have, but that will be coming. I can definitely leave Anne my contact information. And my dissertation will be coming out in hopefully the next 6 to 9 months, and that will all be in there.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, that's great that you were able to have that. Um, Nick is curious if there's a difference in weed volume from grazed to non-grazed. Yeah.
And that is very interesting. As we got into year like 5 and 6 in this study, we as with the microbial stuff, that was conversations we started having where we were like, we wish we were weed scientists and we would have been measuring these things because we were seeing differences, but that was not something that we were measuring. Actually, we didn't see a lot of differences between the grazed and non-grazed, but we did see more weed pressure in the manure plots, compared to the non-manured plots. So it was interesting how that was coming out, but we wish that we would have been, because the other thing that we noticed was that each year we had a different weed that we had major pressure from. And so just looking into that would have been super interesting, but we are a two-man lab, and so we can only do so much. So that was not something that we
Yeah.
specifically looked at, but we did see more weed pressure in the manure plots compared to the non-manure plots.
Okay. Yeah, and Bob has a comment. I mean, it sounds like you didn't have an epidemiology or I'm saying the wrong word. But to study on this in terms of insects or like pest management, because cattle, he's just have general comment here. As cattle manure application appears to have been seasonal and intermittent, perhaps generalist dung beetles that are known as tunnelers did not have an opportunity to increase their population. But if one of the strips was left in permanent pasture, then perhaps you would have served as a refuge for those dung beetles. So again, just thinking about the pest management side of that maybe not pest management, but also what is I said epidemiologist, but that's not it. That's healthcare.
Entomologist.
Thank
Yep.
you. I was like, I can picture it in my head. Thank you for helping me out, Alyssa,
Yep.
on the study. Any comments about that? I'm guessing that's not something that you were specifically.
Yep. Not in my wheelhouse. I think this
Yeah.
is it's the cool thing, but also the hard thing about integrated crop and livestock research, where we are working across all of these different disciplines. And like we want to know everything about the system, but also to be able to have quality data about anything, you have to focus on different things. And so I think I don't have a comment to that specifically, but I do wish that we were able to measure everything and understand everything that's happening. But they're so complex and there's all of these different components working together that makes it hard to study, which is why we're just now starting the body of literature that's helping us understand what's going on in them.
Yeah, absolutely. And Heather's helping me out again with the entomologist. I apologize having one of those moments, but a diverse team because so often in our professional lives, we are, specialists. And that can come up, especially with this integrated work that you're talking about here. If you're thinking, oh, a weed specialist and entomologist, thinking about all the different types, or you even talked about soil health as well, and not necessarily being the pure focus at the beginning.
Mhm.
Ashley has an interesting question. In an ideal world, what variables do you wish you would have measured as a part of the study?
Ooh. I do wish that we would have done more of the microbial stuff from the beginning. And even now, we have not measured anything microbial with the exception of that active carbon, which is just a peripheral of that microbial community that we're looking at anyways. But I do think um, when we start talking about sustainability and using cover crops and those types of things, the common number is you don't start seeing a major effect until you've done it for 5 to 10 years. But I do think that there is some literature that's coming out that says that our microbial communities are responding more quickly. You might not see it in your yield or your organic matter, those kinds of things, but it would have been interesting to see how those populations were changing over time as we got farther into these rotations for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Robert is curious a little bit more about the grazing methods.
Mhm.
So, continuous stocking or rotational grazing and how long and during what times were the plots grazed? And the plots that were stocked with cows but not planted with a winter animal, do they have supplemental feeds? What were those?
So starting with the grazing methods, we did use continuous stocking here. I can go back to
Yeah, you're
that
still sharing your
picture.
screen,
It
so
might
feel
help a
free if
little
I can
bit.
help you to show.
Yeah. So this was the layout of our plot. And so in that corn and soybean rotation, we graze that corn residue, and then we would graze the oat cover crop and those that were in wheat. And we would graze the oat cover crop first. And so each of these had their own individual fence. So we weren't grazing this whole half at once. So we'd graze one oat cover crop, we'd close that gate, we would move them over to the second oat cover crop, and then we would move them into the corn residue. After that, we'd do each rep at a time, just with the way that the building fence worked there. And the corn residue, we would graze until the leaves and the husks were gone. So it's wasn't a super quantitative measure, but these plots were so small, we couldn't go out and do residue collection every couple days to see where they were at. But by observationally, we grazed until the leaves and the husks were gone, and then the oat cover crop residue, we grazed until there was about 2 inches left. And so it was more observational, but that was what we could do on this small scale to have pretty heavy pressure without overgrazing those areas. And then he said, in the plots that were stocked with cows, but not planted into a winter annual. So that was the way that this was set up. So that's talking about the corn residue. I think we didn't provide supplemental feed. We just moved them once they ran out of corn residue to the next one. And then once the entire study had been grazed, we just took them off in this study.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. So yeah, then Dan is kind of getting as a follow-up to that is, you measure weight gain on the cows,
Mhm.
typical grazing, winter grazing in that area?
Yep. So we did not measure weight gain. For reference, these plots are 15 by 50-foot plots. So the cows were grazing for about a day, maybe day and a half, which in the animal science world is not long enough to measure weight gain. They weren't taking on enough to do that. And so that was what that large scale study was that happened before they started this one. So there is some papers out about weight gain where they had great weight gains on the corn residue for sure, and then definitely maintain their weight on that cover crop system too. So we did not do that because we didn't have the capacity to do that for this study since it was so small.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Heather's just making a note here that ATTRA has a great sustainable ag bulletin on nutrient cycling and the important role of ruminant animal grazing and pasture systems. And the end publication has some additional research and resources for reference and review. So yeah, I think that's probably the question that I have coming back is, when we talked about this as a soil health nexus team, and I will admit this is not my particular area of expertise, but it didn't seem like there was a ton of resources out there. And some of those resources are even pointing to peer reviewed work or dissertations and research like yourself. So is that something you also were finding through your work, that the integrated piece of it, there was limited expertise or limited research on it, that's a hole there? I'm curious what you have seen, as maybe it's pointing to us that those that are interested in integrated systems, where else we should be looking, as certainly you'd be up to date on this research, having your dissertation focus on it.
I would say that there is definitely a need and especially, so when I'm writing my dissertation, I have to focus on that peer-reviewed research. That's just what's accepted when I'm writing my papers and those types of things. And so in that world of academic research, there's a huge disparity between like regular corn research and then integrated putting cattle on a corn stalk type research. And so, and that's for what it's doing to the plants, what it's doing to the soil, what it is doing to the animals. There's not a lot of that. And so that was why this came up originally, was there is this need. We're getting questions about what's happening to our fields when we put cattle on them, what's happening to the cattle when we put them on our fields, those types of things. They were questions coming into the extension specialists where this project came from, and there was just not a lot of publications out there that have any sort of numerical response to that. And that's across the United States. There is some of the data that I've seen has come out of like South America and Australia, which especially in Australia is looking at different grazing animals than what we're using in the United States. They have a lot of sheep over there comparatively to the cattle that we're using here. So we're really excited about this because like I kind of touched at the beginning, there's positive views and negative views about integrating livestock together. And so we can see here that there might be more of a benefit than we thought in the first place, or it'll be completely neutral. So then you get that economic benefit. And there will be economic pieces that come out of this as well. That's not my focus because I'm not an economist, but I do think that there is a need for more of the research, more questions being asked. And like we've come up here, like there's even more questions that have come out of my research that has some answers than we probably have more questions than answers with all of this, with the complexity of these integrated systems. So
yeah, absolutely. Okay, that's helpful. helpful to folks, and certainly we can look. Heather's noting there is a gap in that integrated system type of research and what out there is typically found under that kind of regenerative agriculture piece. I think it's interesting too. A lot of folks were looking at different pieces when it comes to integration, and there wasn't as much a risk specifically on soil health. So obviously, one of the reasons we saw your paper and wanted to invite you to speak with us today. Certainly, your research is an interesting point for those folks, as you mentioned in the beginning, that may be concerned about compaction. You weren't showing that as an issue, but it also wasn't a ton on the plus side either for those folks that are really wanting to promote integration or promote businesses on row crops. Any other questions for Alyssa from the team or from the group here? All right. Well, Alyssa, if you wouldn't mind stop sharing your screen. I can share my screen here and I'll show our breakout rooms. We do have some time for breakout rooms, so we will do that as able. I do see a comment here. Are you hearing me talk, Alyssa? Okay, yeah, I'm just seeing someone else's
I
here.
note taker. So yeah, the note taker didn't, it heard silence, so it quit taking notes. So it wonders if it's over. You gotta love it.
Apologies. Laura had a note here that I'm just saying, she's more interested to see the lack of difference between grazing and manure application, bringing in livestock, which is likely a hard sell for many producers who don't already have them. I would agree, like it kind of calms that compaction idea, but if you don't already have livestock, it's not giving you a big incentive to do that. Certainly if you already have livestock and saying, oh, I'm worried about putting them out there, yeah, this research can be a great avenue to say, you don't need to worry about it, go for it.
Right.
Obviously it's just, just one study, but a very important one. I think it is interesting for those folks that aren't integrated. It's not providing a ton of incentive out
Yep.
there.
A lot of that incentive, I believe, will come from that economic perspective of reducing your feed costs or being able to rent your residues for sure. But definitely it is good for the manure that we're finding.
Yes, I'm sure the manure folks are sitting over here saying, yeah, the power of manure, I could have told you that. No, okay, I'm just gonna share my screen again here. And what we can go over these breakout groups for our folks. So we're gonna have breakout groups on a couple different groups here. You can choose between educator, researcher, agency, student, or farmer. And what are we going to talk about? So you can talk about the impression of the topic of Alyssa's talk, of her research findings, or any current research that you know of that might support or claim what was discussed and kind of how this could be used as a part of your research and programming. Are you getting questions from this about producers that you'd be able to address? I also welcome any other further topics on future webinars. So this is a monthly webinar series. We do feature different soil health related topics each month. And I wanted to go ahead and let you know, I know many of us are going to be heading out for the holidays shortly after this, but when we come back in January, we do have a great talk lined up. Our next Soil Health Digital Cafe is Wednesday, January 22nd, same time, 2 p.m. Central Time. And we're going to have Andrew Hans here from Iowa State University talking about the ISU cover crop economic tool. We recently had a session on conservation finance, and there are quite a few tools out there. This one was highly rated as one that folks wanted to know about, so we'll be able to dive into that a little bit more in terms of what are the inputs, outputs, and how could it help you when working with producers. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and open up those breakout rooms for folks. All right. So you should be able to go to the bottom of your screen and now see breakout rooms. I just opened them. I do have it so that you can go ahead and choose your own room. So feel free to choose educator, agency, student, or farmer. We also have NGO there as well. For folks that might be in a group without a ton of people, I'll hop in and let you know. I'll stop the recording now as well because the breakout rooms will not be recording.